Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Ma. I created Subset Games with Matthew Davis. We've released 2 games so far. I do the majority of the art. Matt did all of the coding, and we worked together on design. Everything else was done by our super talented contractors. So our first game, FTL, if you don't know it, it was a spaceship simulation game. We put you in the commander's chair and ask you to help your crew survive a very perilous galaxy. So, and our second game, and the focus of this talk, is Into the Breach. It is a minimalistic tactics game where you fight giant monsters using mechs. There's permadeath, random missions, and time travel. Unlike most other tactics games, defending the city, not killing the enemy, is the highest priority. So you lose if the city is sufficiently damaged. And perhaps maybe the most interesting aspect of its design is the fact that you can see what every enemy is going to be doing before they do it. So you have perfect and complete knowledge to use their attacks against them and try and avoid any sort of damage. So this talk is, I'm going to briefly go through the evolution of Into the Breach before going on to some design suggestions and ideas. So overall, Into the Breach took about 4 years to ship, which was very long compared to FTL's 18 months. So this is a very basic timeline of how the strategy section evolved throughout development. The details aren't really that important, but it's just meant to give you a sense of how we would try something, it would fail, and then we try something else. There were many times that we would put 6 months into working on a design before entirely cutting it. So these slides were adapted from an hour-long talk, so I'm going to be going pretty quick. Keep that in mind. So the first prototype is there on the left. It was originally just a very simple tactics game where each unit would act in turns, sort of like Final Fantasy X. And eventually we discovered that the telegraphing of enemy attacks in the bottom center there was particularly interesting. So we decided to focus the game on that entirely. And at that point, we started shifting to an isometric perspective in the combat. And we gradually figured out some sort of fun basis for the game. However, a very large question remained, which was, what was the actual rest of the game? What's the motivation for this combat? So our first pass on the metagame involved a very large map where you tried to hold back the enemy across multiple cities. It was very XCOM inspired, but it ended up not really working since you didn't really care about protecting the cities too much, and it was generally pretty boring and repetitive to just chase the enemy around. Since we wanted you to bond more with the city, we decided to shrink the city down and hope that you would start recognizing areas over time as you fought in them multiple times. The threats would appear in a specific region, and you had to decide if it was worth sending your units to that area or not. It was still pretty complicated. There was tons of things that you had to manage, but it wasn't really clear if your strategy was good or not. We ended up having the same sort of design problem as the first of the XCOM remakes, where you can get into a situation where you've already lost, but you don't really know it until another hour or two of gameplay, and that's a design trap that we really desperately wanted to avoid. So overall, the game was interesting and had a lot of good points, but it felt like we were making 2 bad games instead of 1 good game. And that right image, we spent maybe a little more than a year on trying to get that 4-region city to feel right. So after much soul searching, we decided to cut the entire strategy layer of the game. And this was the big turning point. We decided to 100% focus on individual battles, since that was the only thing that was actually fun. The game would just be a series of fights. We felt like we were on the right direction, but there's still a lot of questions. We still wanted there to be decision-making in the strategy view, even if it was much smaller than it was before. It was just a big challenge to figure out how that would actually play out in the game. Finally, we ended up with this island design that was in the final game, and we hung on to some of the old principles for a long time, such as these assets, which would give you special abilities, but eventually we decided to even cut those and support units and all this other stuff in favor of just going clear, understandable, simple, randomized rewards for basic missions. So all in all, it took almost 3 years to figure out what the game that we even wanted to make would be. We cut maybe 2 years worth of work and threw out designs that we really loved and wanted to work somehow. In the end, the final game was maybe 10% of what we were initially hoping. But all in all, it was a much better and streamlined experience. A few concessions. This amount of cutting and refinement is probably a lot harder to achieve with larger teams, since it was mostly just Matt and I during this period. Getting really emotionally invested in the design, we could more easily get over the loss of a feature. If it were other team members' content that we were cutting and throwing out, it would probably have been a lot more problematic. And of course, this long and painful trial and error approach to game design was really only possible because FTL gave us the financial freedom to take our time and make something we really want. We didn't have deadlines or expectations, so we were basically able to go back to the drawing board whenever necessary. And that luxury, however, didn't really make those design decisions easier, but we were very fortunate to even have the opportunity to make those types of decisions. So the rest of this talk is some design techniques that I learned throughout this process of FTL and Into the Breach. I tried to analyze the way that Matt and I approach design to create some of the tips that you all can maybe learn from. And the following is what I came up with. I don't know if you will learn from it, and if not, there's no refunds. So these aren't necessarily rules that we follow, it's just naturally how we approach design. First, I need to talk about how I personally think about design. When I think about a feature, I usually break it into two parts, what I'm calling low-level and high-level design. I'm sure other designers have better names, it's just how I think about it. So low-level design is the details, how it works, what are the numbers, and so forth. High-level design is more abstract. Why does this feature exist? What role does it play? Mario's jumping is more than numbers. It's a movement mechanic and attack, a way to hit buttons, the primary positive, satisfying feeling in the game. If a feature's high-level design doesn't actually result in the game being better, I feel like the feature is pointless and it shouldn't exist. Essentially, one describes what the feature is, while the other describes why it exists, what is the way it interacts with the player, what is the user experience, and so forth. So an example, Splunky's Ghost. If you don't know Splunky, get out. Just kidding. It's a roguish platformer with permadeath. So what is the Ghost's low-level design? It appears at a set amount of time, it chases you through walls, it can't be killed, if it touches you, you die. So that's how it works, but what role does the Ghost play? It encourages you to go fast and throw caution to the wind. The game is full of traps, and if you could take all the time you want, you can more easily avoid them. It creates interesting choices. You don't have time to go everywhere on the map, so you have to pick and choose. It reduces the feeling of grinding. Without some sort of time limit, you would feel like you have to see every area of the map to get as much money and resources as possible, like Enter the Gungeon or something. It also increases the skill cap. Good players can explore most of the map before the Ghost arrives, giving them an advantage later on, and there are some advanced tricks that you could do with it. So on paper, having an invulnerable enemy just chase you around if you take too long doesn't seem that important, but if you understand the high-level design, it's much more clear which features are actually adding to something to the game that you want and which aren't. And of course, it's important to note how easily the low-level design actually changes the high-level design. So if the time before the Ghost appeared was a minute later, there may be almost no threat. And if it came a minute earlier, you would basically have to sprint to the end every single time. So knowing the low-level design is pretty easy to figure out, but how do I figure out, at least in my mind, what the high-level design is? I generally like to just ask a whole bunch of questions. So continuing to use Splunky's Ghost idea. First, how does it force the player to act? So even just the threat of the Ghost puts pressure on the player to move forwards. Even before they arrive, it may change the way that you play. What would it be like without the Ghost? You'd probably feel completely free to take your time and explore. Enemies wouldn't feel as dangerous, and you would feel like you have to explore everywhere and blah, blah. How does it interact with the other features? It forces you to have to decide whether you want to go for the key or the store, plus there's tons of traps, and the time pressure can often cause you to make mistakes. So why is talking about high-level design useful? The first tip, if you think a feature of another game adds something important to its design and you want to do the same thing in your game, I suggest figuring out the high-level design of the feature and bringing that to your game instead of the details of the low-level design. So if you like the ghost and you want something to make the player move faster, instead of copying the ghost's mechanics, try and figure out something that has the same overall effect on the player as the ghost. If you use the high-level as a goal, the high-level design as a goal, it makes it easier to try and think of good low-level design. You know what you're trying to achieve, so you can just tweak numbers until it gives you that feeling that you want. And if you copy the exact low-level design, it will, of course, end up with a very different high-level design, which is the biggest problem with this, in my opinion. So, for example, let's take a look at 3 very different games and different game mechanics. Hunger meters and roguelikes, the Ghost and Splunky, the Fleet and FTL. These effectively all have the same high-level design in my mind. Prevent the player from exploring the whole map, force the player to have to make choices and perhaps make mistakes, add a sense of foreboding the longer you stay. However, the same high-level design is created by very different mechanics. So Splunky doesn't necessarily need the Ghost, but it definitely needs something to keep the game moving forward quickly. And similarly, when we designed the Fleet in FTL, we were very much thinking, we need a hunger meter, but what does that mean for our game? So my next suggestion, figuring out the high-level design of a feature is also one of the primary ways that we make the hard decision to change or cut a feature. So we would analyze every feature in the game and figure out which ones are adding to the game and cut the rest. So the huge map seemed like it was interesting, but it actually turned out that it was taking away from one of our primary design goals, so we just had to get rid of it. If we end up finding that multiple features all perform the same function, we generally try to consider cutting or combining them. So there was a number of mechanics that essentially all played the same role in the game. Once we took out the whole strategy layer, the support units, the passive effects, assets, mech equipment, all this stuff, basically we're doing the same thing in the game, so we just simplified and streamlined the game by combining them all into mech equipment and pilots to a smaller degree. So analyzing the high-level design also helps you be objective and realize when something just is not working. So we really wanted to have FTL-like text events in the game, but it just didn't fit with the rest of the mechanics and atmosphere. So in the end, it didn't feel like it was adding enough to the game to justify its existence, so we cut the feature entirely. It can be really hard to let go of designs that you love, but I find if you are more logical, it helps give you the distance to be able to make these difficult decisions more easily. So in short, thinking about high-level design is just one of the ways that we try and be objective about our own game design. I would also suggest that you think about the things that you just assume have to be in your game because of genre, platform, or standard practice. If you figure out the high-level design of all of these assumed features, you can sometimes come up with interesting alternative ways of achieving the same goal, which of course helps your game stand out. So does your RPG really need strength, intelligence, dexterity, and so forth? Do mages really have to wear cloth armor? Analyze these types of standard assumed designs and just determine if they're actually improving your game or not. Creating new ways of achieving the same high-level design can also result in new interesting mechanics. So for example, in Braid, I don't know how he made it, but Jonathan Blow basically questioned the basic assumption that time progresses forwards. And so by doing that, a ton of interesting gameplay and mechanics were possible. And of course, that being said, most standard game designs are there for a reason. There's nothing wrong with sticking with what works. It's generally a balance between giving players something that they're used to and already understand and giving them something new that they have to learn but is interesting. So I would suggest that you at least consider if all these assumed features are necessary. Even if you conclude that in the end that yes, they are, it's much better to come to that conclusion on your own. This is perhaps obvious, but it's super important. Try to spend your development time efficiently. It's critical to know your strengths and weaknesses. If no one is familiar with network code and you can't hire someone else, I would be very wary of adding multiplayer on a small project, for example. There are so many different ways that we could be improving our games over time, but it's really important to figure out what is actually worth the effort. So I always wanted to go back in FTL and improve the jump animation and add more planets and stuff because there was like 5 total. But it's true that it would be that better art and animation would make the game better, but I instead spent my time on adding more events and weapons because I felt like my personal time was better spent doing that. It would yield a better improvement in the game for the same amount of time and effort. And of course, it's great to make the biggest and best game possible, but in the end, you still have to ship it, and I would much prefer to ship a smaller, streamlined game than to keep working, honestly. So for example, we could have added, voice acting to FTL, which would have been like 100 times the amount of work for like 10% better actual play experience, I don't know. So this tip is more situational. When you have a choice between 2 designs that would both work fine, pick the one that's nicest to the player. So if the player can think of an alternative design that makes just as much sense as the one that's in the game, right or wrong, in the player's mind, the game is being unfair, and you can't change that. In general, I feel it's better for the player to blame themselves entirely when something bad happens to them. In XCOM, if you walk in front of an enemy and get shot, it feels like your mistake. But if you fire with 95% accuracy and miss, it feels like the game made a mistake. So if the player can blame the game, it builds animosity, which doesn't help your case. That being said, the player is not always right. Very often, things that feel unfair to the player are actually necessary to the design, so I would suggest using this sparingly. So some examples in FTL, if you destroy the boss at the exact same time that your ship gets destroyed, since it doesn't really hurt the game lore or systems to just let the player win, we just let you win. Into the Breach, there's an ability to heal when you kill an enemy. Initially, we had these minion units that wouldn't trigger this effect because they're not really enemies. But after player feedback, we decided it didn't hurt the design just to let them heal after killing these enemies, so we just put it in the game. So simply put, if you can see a more player-friendly alternative design that would work just as well, you can bet money that the player will see that also. This is maybe even more situational, but when it works well, it's really satisfying. Very often, a design seems like it's a good idea, but just feels off. And in some cases, if you take your solution to the problem that you're trying to solve and invert it, you can come up with a much more fun design. So this is an odd sentence, but let's take an example. In Shovel Knight, which is a platformer, there are checkpoints. If you walk past a checkpoint, it's automatically activated. However, you can choose to destroy the checkpoint, which gives you money but adds the risk since you can no longer respawn there. So apparently it wasn't always like this. Supposedly the developers, they knew they wanted a risk versus reward system with the checkpoints, but the initial design was different. They started deactivated and then you had to pay to activate them. So the problem with this is the player would end up feeling guilty every time they chose to activate the checkpoint. They'd feel like they failed somehow. By inverting the design and turning this negative choice into a positive choice where you're safer by default, but you get to choose to be riskier, it turned out to be a lot more fun. So after FTL, we tried to avoid all random chance with Into the Breach as much as possible, in part because we know, as we all know, it feels super awful when you expect something good to happen and it doesn't. For example, the missing even a 70% chance to hit. It just feels awful. However, there is one area where we realized we need random chance mechanic. So there's a problem in our game where if you get to a really bad turn or a turn that you're going to lose, you would never hit end turn because you just don't want to watch that. So we had to add some sort of random chance to be able to force the player to just hit the end button and see what happens. So we added this low chance to resist all damage to buildings. However, since this percent of happening is very low, you never really get to rely on it. It makes it feel like a pleasant surprise rather than something that you can really factor into your strategy. And perhaps as a result, we get way less people complaining about luck in Into the Breach than FTL, even though it has effectively the same mechanic, but just by changing the numbers, we changed the feeling. So these last two tips are just personal preferences. If you want players to fully understand the situation and use logic to figure out the best strategy, I suggest designing your game to use low numbers whenever possible. Human brains can only hold so many numbers in your head at once, and so if you want to feel like the player's making informed decisions, it's better to keep the numbers low. And high numbers is generally just hiding the strategy. Your attack may do 3,000 damage out of 10,000 health, but usually the only thing that matters is how many hits does it take. So Mario vs. Rabbids had an interesting solution. All attacks that involved chance were just a coin flip. It was easy to understand and hard to get frustrated at. And of course, this decision is only really important in games where it's very strategy focused. So if your game uses like numbers to be dramatic and flashy, then just go nuts, it's fine. The last suggestion is only if you don't have a narrative heavy game. I feel like your time is better spent creating a rich world over lots of text. So to me, the rich atmosphere, sense of wonder, uncertainty of Hyperlight Drifter and Journey make a much more compelling experience, especially in an interactive medium. In my opinion, also, Metroid Fusion had a ton of text, but it didn't actually improve the overall game experience compared to Super Metroid. It generally just slowed the game down in unappreciated ways. And this is a very general suggestion, but if you can convey the same idea using less text, please do it. So we create a huge backstory for our game worlds and characters in the game worlds to sort of help make the game feel coherent overall and consistent. But I feel like our games would actually be worse if we made those things explicit. And of course, this isn't the right choice for every game. It's generally just my preference in games. So that's all the tips I have for you now. Very often we don't follow these rules consciously. These are just things that I've found that we've done. And I've tried to analyze our actions over time to come up with something useful. There's no perfect answer for every team, but hopefully this has given you a little insight into the way that we design games. Thank you so much.